job advertisement appeared on a freelance security website, sandwiched between postings for mall security and event staff positions. Night watchman needed for decommissioned amusement park. 6-month contract, housing included on site. Minimal qualifications required. Must be comfortable working nights and in isolated conditions. The pay was almost double what similar positions offered, which should have been a warning sign, but Thomas Rivera had been out of work for 3 months, his savings depleted, his options narrowing. He submitted his application before he could talk himself out of it. The response came within hours. A phone interview was scheduled for the following day with the property manager, a woman named Catherine Wells. She explained that Wonderland Park had closed 8 years ago after a series of financial difficulties. And one tragic accident, the rides had been shut down, the staff dismissed, but the property remained owned by an investment group that was required to maintain basic security to protect against vandalism and liability. Previous security guards had quit unexpectedly, leaving them desperate for reliable personnel. Could Thomas commit to the full 6-month term? He said yes, without hesitation. The drive to Wonderland Park took most of a day, the route taking him through increasingly rural areas until he was on back roads that barely appeared on his GPS. The park sat at the end of a long access road, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and a marshy lake on the 4th. As he approached, the rides emerged from the trees like the bones of some ancient creature. Skeletal and still, the Ferris wheel dominated the skyline, its empty cars swaying gently in the wind. Beyond it, he could see the twisted loops of roller coaster tracks, the peaked roofs of game booths, the faded shapes of attractions that had once brought joy, but now radiated only abandonment and decay. The main gate stood open, the ticket booths empty, their windows dark. He drove through and parked near what had been the administrative building. Catherine Wells was waiting for him, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back severely, and an expression that suggested she smiled rarely. She shook his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong and led him inside without preamble. The building interior was in better condition than the exterior suggested. The power worked, the plumbing functioned, and his living quarters on the 2nd floor were clean and reasonably comfortable. A bedroom, a bathroom, a small kitchen, and a sitting room with windows that overlooked the park. Catherine gave him a brief tour, pointing out the security office with its monitors connected to cameras scattered throughout the grounds, the supply closet, the emergency exits. Then she handed him a key ring heavy with keys and a folder containing his instructions. "Your duties are straightforward," she said. "Patrol the park twice each night, once at midnight and once at 4 in the morning. Check all locks and gates. Document any signs of trespassers or damage. Monitor the security cameras. In addition to these basic responsibilities, There are specific rules you must follow. She opened the folder and removed several sheets of paper covered in typed text. These rules are not negotiable. Previous guards who ignored them did not complete their contracts. Some left voluntarily. Others had to be removed. Do you understand? Thomas took the papers and read them. The rules were numbered 1 through 10. Rule 1. The park music system is deactivated. If you hear music playing anywhere in the park, return to the administrative building immediately. Lock yourself in your quarters. Do not leave until the music stops. Rule 2. The carousel should remain covered with its tarp. If you find the tarp removed, do not look at the carousel directly. Replace the tarp immediately and leave the area. Rule 3. All ride controls are locked in the off position. If you see any ride operating, do not approach it. Document it from a distance and report it in your logbook. Rule 4. If you encounter people in the park during your patrol, verify they are solid and cast shadows before approaching. If they do not meet both criteria, leave the area and return to the building. Rule 5. The funhouse mirrors have been covered. Do not remove the coverings. If you see your reflection in an uncovered mirror, leave immediately without looking at it again. Rule 6. The bumper car arena is off limits. Do not enter it for any reason. If you hear sounds coming from inside, ignore them. Rule 7. If you find rides or attractions in different positions than they should be, document it, but do not attempt to investigate or correct it. Rule 8. The mascot costumes are stored in the costume shop. That door must remain locked at all times. If you find it open, secure it immediately and do not look inside. Rule 9. During your patrols, stay on the main paths. Do not take shortcuts through the attractions or behind the buildings. The paths are marked and well maintained for a reason. Rule 10. Trust the rules. Everyone who has followed them has completed their term safely. Those who did not follow them are no longer available for comment. Thomas looked up from the papers. Catherine was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. What happened to them? He asked. The ones who did not follow the rules. Catherine's face remained neutral. That information is not relevant to your employment. What matters is that you understand the rules exist for your safety. This park has a history. Not all of it is pleasant. Follow the rules and you will be fine. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. A final piece of advice. Do not attempt to understand why the rules exist. Simply follow them. Curiosity is dangerous here. She left him alone in the administrative building as the sun began to set. Thomas unpacked his belongings and tried to settle in, but the silence was oppressive. Outside his window, the park stretched away in all directions, a maze of empty structures and motionless rides. He could see the carousel from where he stood, a large round structure covered by a heavy blue tarp that shifted slightly in the wind. Beyond it stood the funhouse with its distorted exterior, windows that bulged and twisted. Further still, the dark hulk of the roller coaster climbed against the darkening sky. His first patrol was scheduled for midnight. He spent the evening familiarizing himself with the security monitors, noting the camera positions and the areas they covered. Many sections of the park had no coverage blind spots where the cameras did not reach. The bumper car arena, for instance, had no cameras at all, just an empty placeholder on the monitor grid labeled offline. He checked the logbook kept in the security office and found entries from previous guards. The most recent entries were from someone named Marcus Webb. They started professionally, dated and detailed. Midnight patrol completed. All gates secure. No signs of trespassers. Camera 7 showing static, recommend maintenance. Then, about 3 weeks into Marcus's employment, the tone changed. Heard music during patrol. Source unknown. Returned to building per Rule 1. Music stopped after 40 minutes. A week later, saw carousel tarp displaced. Did not look directly at carousel. Replaced tarp. The handwriting in these later entries was less steady, as though written in haste. Thomas flipped through older entries from other guards. Similar patterns emerged, normal observations, followed by increasingly disturbed notes about rule violations and strange occurrences. One guard named Jennifer Chen had written, "The rides should not move. They have no power, but I saw the Ferris wheel turning last night." Followed Rule 3, did not approach. Another guard, name illegible, had scrawled across an entire page, "Get out while you can. This place is wrong." That was the final entry in their section. He closed the logbook and checked the time. 11:30, half an hour until his first patrol. He equipped himself with a heavy flashlight, a radio that connected to nothing since he was alone, and the keys. The air outside was cool and smelled of rust and rotting wood. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty pathways lined with shuttered game booths and silent attractions. The park felt wrong at night. During the day, it would have looked merely abandoned, sad, but mundane. In darkness, it transformed into something else entirely. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision. The wind through the structures created sounds, almost like voices. His footsteps echoed strangely, as though someone paced alongside him, just out of sight. He forced himself to walk steadily, checking locks and gates, documenting everything in the small notebook he carried. He passed the carousel and confirmed the tarp was in place. The funhouse loomed to his left, its entrance gaping like a mouth. He gave it a wide berth, staying on the main path. The roller coaster structure creaked above him, metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes. He told himself that was normal. Old structures made noise. There was nothing supernatural about thermal expansion. The patrol took nearly an hour. He checked every area accessible from the main paths, confirmed all perimeter gates were secure, and returned to the administrative building without incident. He logged the patrol. First midnight patrol completed. All secure. No anomalies observed. His handwriting looked steady, professional. He wondered how long that would last. The 4 a.m. patrol passed similarly. The park in the deep hours before dawn felt even stranger than it had at midnight. The darkness was more complete, the silence more profound. He moved quickly, efficiently, and was back inside within 40 minutes. Dawn came gray and unwelcome. He made coffee and watched the sun illuminate the park, transforming it back into something that looked almost normal in daylight. Almost. The first 3 days established a routine. He slept during the late morning and afternoon, woke in early evening, spent the hours before midnight monitoring the cameras and reading. The patrols became familiar. The same routes through the same abandoned spaces. He saw no signs of trespassers. The cameras showed nothing unusual. If not for the rules and the ominous logbook entries, it would have been the easiest job he had ever had. The music started on his 4th night. He was in the security office, watching the monitors, when he heard it. Faint at first, barely audible, the cheerful calliope melody of carousel music. His blood went cold. The music system was deactivated. There should be no music. He stood and moved to the window, listening. The sound was definitely coming from outside, from somewhere in the park, getting louder. Rule 1 was explicit. If you hear music, return to your quarters immediately. He was already in the building, but he went upstairs and locked himself in his apartment. The music grew louder, no longer faint, but clear and unmistakable. Carnival music, the kind that played from speakers throughout amusement parks, cheerful and bright, and completely wrong in this context. He could hear multiple sources now. The carousel music was joined by the pipe organ melodies that had played in the funhouse. Then, the whistling steam calliope from the train ride, song after song, overlapping and building until the entire park seemed to ring with music. He sat on his bed, hands over his ears, and waited. The rule said the music would stop. Just wait for it to stop. Minutes crawled past, 10 minutes, 20. The music showed no sign of fading. Through his covered windows, he could see flashes of light, the park's decorative bulbs switching on despite having no power. The rides were illuminated now, visible through gaps in the curtains, standing out against the darkness like monuments in a graveyard. After 35 minutes, the music began to fade. Song by song, the sounds dropped away until only the carousel melody remained, playing alone in the darkness. Then that too faded, and silence returned. The lights went out. The park was dark and quiet again, as though nothing had happened. Thomas waited another 10 minutes before he dared to move, to check the windows, to confirm it was truly over. He logged it immediately. Heard music at approximately 2300 hours. Multiple sources, lasted approximately 35 minutes. Followed Rule 1. Remained in quarters until music stopped. His hand shook as he wrote. The park was not simply abandoned. Something about it was actively wrong, and the rules existed to navigate that wrongness. He tried to sleep, but could not. When midnight came, he forced himself to go on patrol, following the main paths with his flashlight, checking the locks. Everything appeared normal. The carousel was covered. The rides were still. There were no signs that anything unusual had occurred, but he knew better now. Appearance meant nothing here. The covered carousel became an object of dread and fascination. He passed it multiple times each night during his patrols, always confirming the tarp was in place. But he wondered what lay beneath. Why was it covered? What would happen if he looked at it? Rule 2 suggested that looking directly at the carousel was dangerous, but not why. The tarp shifted constantly in the wind, sometimes pulling tight, sometimes billowing, as though something beneath it was breathing. On his 9th night, he found the tarp partially displaced. A section had come loose, pulled free from the weights that held it down. He could see part of the carousel platform, the decorative panels, and the bottom portion of one horse. He approached slowly, keeping his eyes averted, looking at the ground rather than the exposed carousel. The horse he could see in his peripheral vision was white with gold trim, frozen mid-gallop, its glass eyes catching his flashlight beam. He grabbed the loose section of tarp and pulled it back over the exposed area, securing it with the weights. The entire time, he felt an overwhelming urge to look, to turn his head and see the carousel fully. The urge was almost physical, a pull like gravity. He resisted and walked away quickly, not looking back. That night, he logged. Found carousel tarp displaced during midnight patrol. Did not look directly at carousel. Replaced tarp per Rule 2. Felt strong compulsion to look. The compulsion concerned him more than the displaced tarp. It had not felt like his own curiosity. It had felt like something external, something trying to make him break the rule. The operating rides appeared during his 2nd week. He was doing his 4 a.m. patrol when he saw it. The Ferris wheel was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely turning. The cars swayed as they rose and fell, empty silhouettes against the pre-dawn sky. He stopped and watched from a safe distance, his heart hammering. The wheel turned smoothly, powered by nothing visible, making no sound except the creak of old metal under stress. Rule 3 said, do not approach operating rides. He stayed where he was, taking out his phone to photograph and document. Through his camera screen, he watched the wheel complete several rotations. Then, as he watched, it began to slow. The rotation decreased until it stopped completely, the cars rocking gently before going still. By the time he returned to log it, the Ferris wheel looked as dormant as it had every other night. Operating Ferris wheel observed during 4 a.m. patrol. Wheel turning despite no power source, did not approach, documented from distance per Rule 3. Wheel stopped after approximately 5 minutes of observation. He set down his pen and stared at the logbook. The wheel had turned. He had seen it. There was no rational explanation. The power to the park was shut off. Even if it had not been, the rides had been mechanically disabled to prevent exactly this kind of thing, yet he had watched it move. The people appeared during his 3rd week. He was on his midnight patrol, passing near the game booths that lined the midway, when he saw them. 2 figures standing near the ring toss booth. They were looking at the prizes still visible behind the counter: faded stuffed animals and cheap toys. He called out, "Hey, this is private property. You need to leave." The figures did not respond, did not turn to look at him. He started walking toward them, and then remembered Rule 4. Verify they are solid and cast shadows. He stopped and shone his flashlight directly at them. The light passed through them. They were translucent, visible but insubstantial, and they cast no shadows despite his flashlight shining on them from an angle that should have created long shadows across the ground. He backed away slowly, keeping the light on them. As he moved, one of the figures turned to look at him. It had the appearance of a young man, maybe 20 years old, wearing clothes that looked decades out of style. The face was wrong somehow, the features too smooth, the expression too neutral. The figure raised one hand as though to wave. Then both figures simply faded away, becoming transparent, and then invisible. Thomas did not run back to the building, but he walked very quickly. He logged it with hands that shook, encountered 2 figures near midway game booths during midnight patrol. Figures were translucent and cast no shadows, did not approach per Rule 4. Figures faded from view after approximately 30 seconds. He added a note: verified Rule 4 exists for good reason. The figures were not human, were not alive, do not know what they were. Sleep became difficult. He would lie in bed during the day, exhausted but unable to quiet his mind. The sounds of the park filtered through his windows, even in daylight. The creak of metal, the rustle of tarps, the distant clang of something falling. Once he was certain he heard children laughing, but when he looked out the window, the park was empty. He started leaving the radio on for white noise, anything to cover the sounds that came from outside. The funhouse mirrors incident happened during his 4th week. He was on patrol, passing the funhouse, when he noticed light inside, a faint glow visible through the entrance. The funhouse had no power. There should be no light. He debated investigating, knowing it was probably a bad idea, but he was responsible for checking unusual activity. He told himself he would just look inside from the entrance, not actually enter. The interior of the funhouse was a maze of corridors and chambers designed to disorient and amuse. He stood at the entrance and shone his flashlight inside, the beam cutting through darkness and catching on covered mirrors that lined the walls. The covers were canvas sheets secured over the reflective surfaces. Rule 5 said, do not remove the covers. But one cover had fallen, lying on the floor, exposing the mirror beneath. He could see the mirror from where he stood. His reflection was visible in it, lit by his flashlight, except the reflection was wrong. It showed him standing in the same position, holding the same flashlight, but the reflection was smiling. Thomas was not smiling. His face was neutral tense, but the reflection grinned widely, teeth visible, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was disturbing. As he watched, the reflection raised its free hand and waved. Thomas's hand remained at his side. Rule 5 said leave immediately without looking at the reflection again. He turned and walked away, resisting the urge to look back, to verify what he had seen. Behind him, he heard laughter, faint and echoing. He did not look back. He returned to the building and logged it. Found uncovered mirror in funhouse. Saw anomalous reflection. Left immediately per Rule 5. Did not return to replace cover. Will report to management. He called Catherine Wells the next morning, using the emergency contact number she had provided. He described what he had seen. She listened without interruption, then said, the maintenance team will replace the mirror cover during daylight hours next week. Do not enter the funhouse again until you are notified it has been secured. And Thomas, the reflection was not you. Do not think about what it might have been. That knowledge is not helpful. The sounds from the bumper car arena began shortly after. The arena was a large enclosed building near the center of the park. Rule 6 said it was off limits. Do not enter it for any reason. He had passed it many times during patrols, always giving it a wide berth. But during his 5th week, he started hearing sounds from inside. The hum of electricity, the buzz and crackle of the bumper car power grid, the distinctive bang of cars colliding. He stood outside the arena during one patrol and listened. The sounds were unmistakable. Inside the locked building, with no power, the bumper cars were operating. He could hear multiple cars moving, colliding, the squeal of steering wheels being turned. And underneath those sounds, something else. Screaming. High-pitched and terrified, it cut through the other noises before being drowned out by another collision. The screaming came again and again, a pattern that suggested it was not random, but part of whatever was happening inside. Rule 6 said ignore the sounds. He forced himself to walk away, to continue his patrol, but the sounds haunted him. Who was screaming? What was happening in that arena? He knew he could not enter to find out. The rule was absolute, but the not knowing ate at him. He logged it, heard sounds of bumper cars operating from inside arena. Also heard screaming. Did not investigate per Rule 6. Duration, approximately 10 minutes before sound ceased. The changed positions started appearing everywhere. Rides that should have been in one configuration would be in another by the next patrol. game booth prizes rearranged, trash cans moved, benches rotated. The changes were never dramatic, but they were constant and impossible to ignore. Something was moving things in the park between his patrols. Rule 7 said document, but do not investigate. He filled page after page of the logbook with notes about changed positions, creating a chronicle of impossible activity. The costume shop incident was the worst. He was on his midnight patrol during his 6th week when he noticed the costume shop door was ajar. Rule 8 was explicit. That door must remain locked at all times. If you find it open, secure it immediately and do not look inside. He approached the door and reached for the handle, preparing to pull it shut without looking in. But before he could, something inside moved. He heard fabric rustling, footsteps, and then saw them through the crack in the door. The mascot costumes. They were moving, not hanging limp on their racks, but standing upright, walking, turning to look toward the door. He could see the park's main mascot, Jolly the Clown, its oversized head turning with mechanical precision, the painted smile seeming wider than it should be. Behind it, other costumes moved in the darkness, animal characters and fantasy creatures, all standing when they should have been collapsed fabric and foam. He slammed the door shut and locked it with shaking hands. From inside came sounds, scratching at the door, the handle turning against the lock, a voice, muffled by the door, but audible, speaking in a tone that tried to sound friendly, but came across as threatening. Come inside. We want to show you something. Come inside and play. He backed away from the door until the voice stopped and the sound ceased. Logging, it took 3 attempts because his hand shook too badly to write clearly. Found costume shop door open during midnight patrol. Secured immediately per Rule 8. Saw costumes moving inside. Did not enter. Heard voice from inside after securing door. Voice stopped after approximately 2 minutes. Recommend additional securing measures for costume shop door. He underlined the last sentence twice. That door needed more than a lock. It needed to be sealed, barred, maybe bricked over entirely. By his 7th week, Thomas understood why previous guards had not completed their terms. The park was not simply haunted or strange. It was actively malevolent, constantly testing, pushing, trying to make him break the rules. The music played frequently now, forcing him to retreat to his quarters multiple times per week. The carousel tarp came loose regularly despite his efforts to secure it properly. The translucent figures appeared nearly every patrol, always watching him, sometimes following at a distance. The rides operated more frequently. The sounds from the bumper car arena grew louder and more disturbing. He dreamed about the park. Nightmares where he walked the paths and found himself lost in sections that should not exist, corridors that twisted into impossible geometries, rides that operated with him strapped inside, unable to escape. He would wake gasping, disoriented, taking long minutes to convince himself he was in his quarters and not still wandering the nightmare version of Wonderland Park that existed in his subconscious. The park wanted him to break the rules. He could feel it. Every displaced tarp was an invitation to look. Every opened door was a dare to enter. Every translucent figure was a test of whether he would approach. The rules were his only protection, and maintaining his adherence to them required constant vigilance. The temptation to deviate, to investigate, to understand was overwhelming. But the logbook entries from previous guards reminded him of the cost of curiosity. Those who broke the rules did not complete their terms. Some left voluntarily. Others had to be removed. What happened to those who had to be removed? Catherine Wells had not said. Thomas did not want to find out. His 8th week brought a new phenomenon. During his 4 a.m. patrol, he noticed lights in the park office, a building he rarely checked because it was always securely locked. The lights were on inside, visible through the windows, and he could see shadows moving. People were inside, but there should be no people. He approached cautiously and looked through the window. Inside, the office appeared to be operating normally. Desks were occupied by figures hunched over paperwork. A telephone rang, and someone answered it. Another figure stood at a filing cabinet, pulling out folders. They were dressed in styles from decades ago, the clothing and hairstyles wrong for the current era. He watched for several minutes before one of the figures looked up and saw him. Their eyes met through the glass, and the figure smiled and waved, then turned back to their work, as though nothing was unusual about a security guard staring through the window at 4 in the morning. Thomas stepped back from the window. This was different from the translucent figures. These looked solid, real, but they cast no shadows despite the bright office lights. Rule 4 applied. Do not approach. He walked away from the office and completed his patrol, but his mind raced. The office figures suggested something about the park's history. Something had happened here, something that left echoes or impressions that replayed endlessly. The park was trapped in some kind of loop, repeating moments from its past. He spent the next day researching the park's history. Internet searches revealed basic information. Wonderland Park had opened 30 years ago and operated successfully for 2 decades. Then accidents began occurring with unusual frequency. Minor injuries at first, then more serious incidents. The final event that closed the park was a death on the roller coaster. A mechanical failure sent a car off the tracks, killing 3 riders. Investigations revealed extensive maintenance neglect. The park was shut down pending legal proceedings that never concluded because the ownership filed bankruptcy. But there were other stories, unofficial accounts from former employees that appeared on obscure forums and local history websites. Claims that accidents had been happening since the park's opening, covered up or downplayed. rumors of a child who disappeared in the funhouse and was never found, whispers about screaming heard from the bumper car arena even when it was empty, a maintenance worker who claimed the carousel horses moved on their own. These stories were dismissed as urban legends, but Thomas now knew better. The legends were true. The park had always been wrong. The rules did not create the danger. They had been developed in response to dangers that already existed. His 9th week began the countdown to completion. He had 3 weeks remaining on his contract. 12 weeks down, 21 patrols left. He started marking them off, counting down like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. Each completed patrol was a small victory. Each night survived brought him closer to leaving this place forever. The music incidents increased in frequency during these final weeks, sometimes multiple times per night, forcing him to barricade himself in his quarters and wait for silence. The rides operated more boldly now, the Ferris wheel turning for hours, the roller coaster, cars racing along their tracks despite having no power. The translucent figures multiplied. He saw dozens of them during patrols, crowds of transparent people standing throughout the park, watching him. They never spoke, but their presence was suffocating. He found himself breaking minor rules without meaning to, walking too close to restricted areas, glancing at the carousel when checking the tarp, pausing too long near the bumper car arena to listen to the sounds inside. Each minor violation felt like a slippery slope, the park pulling at him, trying to drag him into bigger mistakes. He documented his own rule bending in the logbook, holding himself accountable. Walked within 5 feet of bumper car arena entrance. Too close. Must maintain greater distance. The writing was a way to reinforce the rules, to remind himself why they mattered. During his 10th week, he found a door he had never noticed before. It was set into the side of a service building, painted to match the wall, almost invisible. There was no key for it on his ring, and no mention of it in his instructions. He tried the handle and found it unlocked. Inside was a stairway leading down, deeper than should have been possible given the building's location. He stood at the top of the stairs, shining his flashlight into the darkness below, and heard sounds rising up. Music. The carousel theme played on a music box, distant and echoing. There was no rule specifically about this door or these stairs, but the spirit of the rules was clear. Do not investigate anomalies. Do not enter strange places. He closed the door and walked away. That night, he called Catherine Wells again. There is a door in Service Building 6. Stairs going down. I heard music from below. There was a long silence on the line before she responded. That door should not be there. Do not open it again. Do not go near that building. I will send a crew to seal it. Thomas asked the question that had been building in his mind for weeks. What is this place? What happened here? Why is it like this? Catherine's voice was tired when she answered. Some places are thin, boundaries between what is and what should not be become permeable. Wonderland Park was built on such a place. Maybe that is what caused the accidents. Maybe the accidents made the place thinner. We do not know. What we know is that following the rules keeps people safe. Breaking them does not. Complete your term. Collect your pay. Forget this place exists. But forgetting was impossible. The park was burned into his memory. Every path, every ride, every shadow. He would carry it with him forever, a weight that no amount of time or distance could remove. The best he could hope for was survival, completion of the contract, escape. His 11th week passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. He was sleeping 3 hours a day if he was lucky. The rest of his time spent in a state of anxious wakefulness. The patrols were nightmares he was conscious for. The hours between patrols were spent watching the security monitors, witnessing impossible things. Rides operating, lights switching on, figures moving through the park in groups, translucent crowds walking paths to destinations that no longer existed. On his 73rd night, 6 days before his contract ended, the park pushed harder than ever before. The music started at 10 p.m., hours before his midnight patrol. It played continuously, not stopping, a cacophony of overlapping melodies that made the building vibrate. He huddled in his quarters with pillows over his ears, but could still hear it. At 11 p.m., the lights came on, the entire park illuminated as though it was operating normally. Through his windows, he could see the rides moving. All of them. Every ride in the park spinning, climbing, racing, operating at full capacity, though they had no power and no passengers. At midnight, he should have been doing his patrol. But the music was still playing, and Rule 1 said stay in his quarters. He watched through the windows as the park ran itself, a ghost of its former glory playing out in mechanical repetition. At 1 a.m., the rides began to slow. At 1:30, they stopped. At 2 a.m., the music faded and the lights went dark. At 2:15, silence returned. He waited until 3 a.m. before venturing out to do his delayed patrol. The park showed no signs of what had occurred. The rides were still. The paths were empty. Everything was as it should be, except he noticed something near the carousel. The tarp was completely removed, folded neatly and piled beside the platform. The carousel was fully exposed. He stood at a safe distance and looked at it, breaking Rule 2, unable to help himself. The carousel was beautiful in a terrible way. The horses were ornately carved, each one unique, their faces expressive and disturbingly lifelike, but their positions were wrong. Instead of facing forward, circling the platform in the normal configuration, they faced outward. Every horse turned to look at whoever approached, and their eyes, glass eyes that should have been blank, reflected his flashlight beam with an intensity that suggested awareness. He grabbed the tarp and dragged it back over the carousel, working frantically to cover it. As he worked, he heard music, the carousel theme playing faintly, coming from the carousel itself, though it had no power source. He secured the tarp and backed away, the music fading. He logged it with hands that could barely hold the pen, found carousel tarp completely removed, looked at carousel directly in violation of Rule 2. Horses positioned facing outward, appeared aware, replaced tarp, heard music from carousel while replacing tarp. Music stopped when tarp secured. 6 days remain on contract. Those final 6 days were the longest of his life. Each patrol was an ordeal. The park threw everything at him. Constant music, rides operating non-stop, translucent figures that blocked his path, forcing him to detour. The bumper car arena sounds, loud enough to hear from anywhere in the park. The costume shop door standing wide open every time he passed, requiring him to close it repeatedly while avoiding looking inside. The mirrors in the funhouse, all uncovered, each one showing distorted reflections that moved independently. He stopped sleeping entirely. He sat in the security office during the day, watching the monitors, waiting for night. When night came, he did his patrols like a soldier marching through enemy territory, checking boxes, following routes, getting back inside as quickly as possible. He ate because he had to, but tasted nothing. He spoke to no one. The countdown was all that mattered. 5 days, 4 days, 3 days. On his final night, his last patrol, the park was quiet. No music, no operating rides, no translucent figures. The paths were empty and still. It felt like a reprieve or a trap. He completed the midnight patrol without incident and returned to log it. Final midnight patrol completed. No anomalies observed. Park unusually quiet. 4 a.m. patrol remained. He waited for 4 a.m. with growing anxiety. This final patrol was all that stood between him and completion. He had survived 12 weeks, 84 patrols, countless encounters with impossible things. One more patrol and he was done. He could leave this place and never return. The silence continued. Nothing moved outside his windows. The park waited. At 4 a.m., he forced himself outside. The air was cold and still. His flashlight beam seemed brighter than usual, cutting through darkness that felt less oppressive than it had previous nights. He walked his route, checking locks and gates, moving through the familiar paths. Everything was as it should be. He approached the carousel and confirmed the tarp was in place. He passed the costume shop and the door was locked. The funhouse was dark, no lights inside. Even the bumper car arena was silent. He completed his route and stood at the entrance to the administrative building, his hand on the door. He had done it. The final patrol was complete. In a few hours, Catherine Wells would arrive with his final payment and transportation away from this place. He had survived. As he opened the door, the music started, all of it. every song the park had ever played erupting simultaneously from speakers that should not work. The lights blazed, every bulb in the park igniting. The rides roared to life, spinning and racing. And from every direction came figures. Not translucent this time, but solid, real crowds of people flooding into the park, filling the paths, boarding the rides. The park was operating at full capacity, packed with visitors who should not exist. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway. This was not supposed to happen. He had followed the rules. He had survived. But the park was not done with him. It had waited until his guard was down, until he thought he was safe, to show him this. The full manifestation of what Wonderland Park truly was. Not an abandoned amusement park, but a doorway. A thin place where the boundaries failed and other things leaked through. The crowds moved around him, through him, insubstantial despite their apparent solidity. He could hear their laughter and conversations, but they paid him no attention. They rode the rides and played the games and ate the food from vendors that did not exist. They moved through a version of the park that was not the abandoned ruins, but the fully operational facility it had been years ago. He was seeing the past, or a parallel version of the present, or something else entirely that he had no framework to understand. He backed into the building and slammed the door. Outside, the park raged with impossible life. Inside, he sat on the floor and waited. The sounds continued for 3 hours. At 7 a.m., exactly when the park would have opened during its operational years, everything stopped. The music cut off. The lights went dark. The crowds vanished. Silence returned. Catherine Wells arrived at 9 a.m. She took one look at Thomas and said nothing about his appearance. The exhaustion and fear that must have been evident. She simply handed him an envelope containing his final payment and the keys to the vehicle that would take him away. "You completed your term," she said. "That makes you one of the successful ones. There is a bonus in that envelope for completing without quitting. Use it to start somewhere else, somewhere far from here." "Is it always like this?" Thomas asked, "for everyone who works here?" Catherine considered her answer. "The park tests everyone. What it shows you, what it does, that varies. Some see more than others, some see less. But everyone who follows the rules survives. That is all that matters." Thomas wanted to ask more, but found he could not form the questions. There were no words for what he needed to know. He took the envelope and walked to the vehicle without looking back. As they drove down the access road away from Wonderland Park, he allowed himself one glance in the side mirror. The park receded into the distance, the rides skeletal against the morning sky, looking like any other abandoned facility, looking normal, looking like it was not a doorway to somewhere else. He never spoke about his time at Wonderland Park. How could he explain to anyone what he had experienced? They would think he was insane. He used the payment and bonus to move across the country to a city with no amusement parks anywhere nearby. He took a job in an office with fluorescent lights and cubicles, and normal coworkers who talked about normal things. He tried to build a life that had no room for carousel music or translucent figures or rides that operated without power. But the park stayed with him. He dreamed about it constantly, nightmares where he was still there, still doing patrols, the 12 weeks extending into months and years from which he could not escape. He developed aversions he could not explain to anyone. He would not enter buildings with mirrors. He crossed the street to avoid clowns. The sound of carnival music sent him into panic attacks. The park had marked him permanently, taken something he could not name and would never recover. Years passed. He never returned to Wonderland Park and tried not to think about it. But sometimes, late at night, when he could not sleep, he would search for information about it. The property remained owned by the same investment group. Security guards were still employed on 6-month contracts. The ad still appeared on freelance websites, offering good pay for simple work, attracting desperate people who needed employment and did not ask enough questions. The cycle continued. It always would. He thought about those who came after him, the guards who took the position after his term ended. He wondered if they followed the rules, if they survived. He wondered how many quit early and how many had to be removed. He wondered what happened to those who were removed. Where did they go? What had breaking the rules cost them? These were questions that Catherine Wells would never answer, questions that maybe had no answers at all. The park existed. That was the only certainty. It sat in the forest, abandoned and waiting, thin space where boundaries failed and impossible things became real. The rules existed to protect those who worked there, developed through trial and error by people who had paid the price for learning. And the music played sometimes in an amusement park where the music system was deactivated, where nothing should move or sound or exist, but it did and always would. Thomas Rivera had survived 12 weeks at Wonderland Park. He had followed the rules mostly and lived to tell about it, except he never told. The knowledge was his burden to carry alone, the weight of having witnessed something that should not exist. The understanding that the world was stranger and thinner and more dangerous than anyone believed. Some places were doorways. Some rules were all that stood between survival and something worse. And some jobs, no matter how well they paid, should never be accepted. But desperate people made desperate choices, and Wonderland Park would always be there, waiting, offering employment to those who needed it. The music would start. The rides would operate. The figures would walk the paths, and another guard would begin the 12-week countdown, following rules they did not understand, hoping to survive long enough to escape. The cycle would continue. The park was patient. It had all the time in the world.